So I'm going to go over a little bit of setup on Swan Ganz catheters, what you'll kind of need to get it connected if you get a patient from cath lab, and then also getting all of your numbers up on the screen. So this is a Swan Ganz catheter, kind of got it out of the box. There are two different types. I will tell you that I'm only going to talk about the thermodilution type because after looking at all of the catheters in the ICU, I have only seen a thermodilution catheter. So we do have the option of a continuous cardiac output, which is where you would use the vigilance monitor, but there is not one available, so we're more likely to be doing the thermodilution. If you have a continuous cardiac output Swan, you can also use that to do manual thermodilution cardiac output as well. So anytime you get a patient that comes back from cath lab, these little markers, a large marker is 50, a small marker is 10. It's good to kind of know where it comes out so that you know if it's been dislodged or moved. There will be a swandum or a sterile catheter over the top of that. That way it's available to be advanced or pulled back if you need to. Most likely they're going to be put in the cath lab and it's going to come back to you and you're going to need to hook it all up, okay? So if you get report that your patient's going down for a swan or is coming back up with a swan, I'm going to tell you what you need to get ready for whenever it comes back. So you're going to need 2 primed and ready transducers set up and ready to hook up. So what that looks like is your pressure bag, your saline, and your transducer tubing, okay? You'll need 2 of those. One for the CVP port, one for the pulmonary artery port. If the patient has an arterial sheath or an arterial line, which they most likely will, you will need 3. So when you open your transducer bag, do not throw your labels away. I know every time we open them, we throw them away. This is where it is extremely handy. So blue is for CVP or right atrial pressure, yellow is for the pulmonary artery, and red is for arterial. So when you're getting these ready, you should label this with a dot, and label your stopcocks with the appropriate color so that when all of this tubing is beside your patient and rolled up in a ball and you're troubleshooting why you don't have a waveform, you can easily see, I'm not having an A-line waveform, I'm not having a pulmonary artery waveform. I can troubleshoot that all the way back up into my pressure bag, okay? Okay, so I'm getting a patient from cath lab, the Swan's ready. It's very likely gonna come back to you not hooked up to anything. So first thing I'm gonna do is turn my monitor on and hook up my CVP and my pulmonary artery, okay? So here's what the Swan looks like. So blue is gonna be CVP always and right atrial. So you're gonna hook that one up, the transducer up to that, and then the yellow is also gonna be hooked up to a transducer. This is the pulmonary artery. No medications go through the pulmonary artery port, okay? No titratable critical drip should go through the CVP port, okay? These are gonna have pigtails on them. You should not be flushing any meds through them. There's an extra white port. We call this the VIP port. You can put an anti-reflux valve on here. You can infuse your medications through here. The red with a little syringe here. This is where you would check your wedge pressure, okay? It is important that it doesn't actually accidentally get pushed and held in wedge form. So in order to prevent this, you can make sure it's placed on when you're not attempting to wedge in a completely deflated position. So this is one port. This is the monitor. This goes to the monitor to check cardiac output. So we'll go over that in a second. So hooking, transducer. I'm gonna hook it up to CVP. And then you're gonna need either 3 cords if you have an arterial line, or you're gonna need one of these cords. This was found in the Swan catheter box. So again, these are color coded. Yellow for pulmonary artery, red for arterial, blue for CVP. The monitor does not know where you hook the transducer to the patient. So you have to make sure that you label them correctly, they're color coordinated, and it's correct on the monitor. So I've hooked it to the CVP line. I'm gonna hook blue to blue, and I'm gonna plug it into the monitor and turn it on. So while I'm waiting for that to turn on, this handy dandy box, there's two of them that I've seen, is the cardiac output box. This will hook up to the Swan, to the yellow. Be careful not to bend the wires. And then this will actually go on the thermodilution syringe, which I'll show you where that goes. But you'll need to get this out of the, either where the cords are placed, or I found this in the Swan box. So, all right, so getting my CVP, we're gonna pretend I have another transducer and it's hooked up to my pulmonary artery. You're gonna need to make sure, if you click your xylophone, that all of these are labeled correctly. So if this one here is blue, it's correctly labeled CVP. This one here is pulmonary artery. It's correctly labeled there, and they appear on the screen. So once you hook those up, you should see a waveform if this is connected to the patient. You're gonna need to zero them just like you would any other transducer. You can actually have these already hooked up to the monitor and capped and waiting for your patient to arrive from cath lab. I can zero this before the patient arrives. So I would zero it, and then you should be able to get numbers. Okay, so that's kind of the easy part. Let's talk about the actual cardiac output. So like I said, this is thermodilution cardiac output, which means you're gonna have this cardiac output syringe hooked up to the end of the Swan, and it's gonna measure the cardiac output based on the temperature on the outside of the patient. You inject the saline, and it'll pour out here and measure the temperature, and somehow through thermomechanics will tell you what the cardiac output and index is. So this device is in your all's storeroom where the medicine Pyxis thingy is. You'll need one of these with the saline bag. So this you're going to pull out of the bag and prime with a 500 cc saline bag. Thermometer hooks on here. And then this is going to be hooked in to your CVP port. Okay? So I'm pulling my CVP port. I'm gonna hook it under sterile. Perfect. All right. This is, you see all these wires, this is only one transducer. This is why you label everything, because it's chaos. So we have this hooked up to your CVP. Over here's the patient. This is the bag of saline. This goes to the transducer, okay? So what you're gonna do to start the cardiac output is you need to draw from this saline bag. So I'm gonna turn that off to the patient, and I'm gonna draw up saline into my syringe. 10 cc's of saline. So it's kind of hard to do one-handed, okay? And then we're gonna get ready to set up on the monitor. So I'm gonna turn it off to here. So it's open for me to shoot to my patient, and I'm gonna go over to my screen. So pulling up cardiac output, I need to set up cardiac output. Before we do this, we should set up, we actually should put in the patient's height and weight. So you should put the patient's height and the patient's weight in. If you do this, this will actually estimate your cardiac index, which is a better measure of cardiac output based on their height and weight. So we've put in the height and weight. Now we're gonna shoot the cardiac output. So here, cardiac output, set it up. And so there's a start cardiac output button here. I would click that. When it will tell you here, inject now. And so after it says inject now, I'd very slowly but steadily inject the syringe. And then you'll see a bell curve that comes around. You wait, don't do anything. The monitor will make 2 little dings when it calculates the cardiac output. It does take probably 30 to 45 seconds for it to do. And you would see cardiac index and cardiac output appear there. Ideally, you want cardiac output or index above 2. You can do 2 or 3 of these measures and then take the average. You can accept it or reject it, maybe if you messed up during pushing the syringe or something like that. But just be mindful, these patients are volume overloaded. 30 cc's of syringe, 30 cc's of fluid every hour, or how often you're measuring it. We want to minimize the amount of volume that we're giving. So, I think that's all there is. The way that you tell if it's thermodilution is, it should say it on the outside, TD, thermodilution. You do not need the visual for the thermodilution manual cardiac output 1. The continuous we haven't used it. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about wedge pressure as well. So, wedge pressure is basically what we're doing here is we're inflating the balloon in the pulmonary artery. And so it's basically occluding the pulmonary artery to see what the pressure is behind on the side of the lung side. And so the goal here is to see what the pressure is and how much fluid do we need to get off. So we have a patient now, his wedge pressure is about 17. We're giving diuresis, and we have a goal of a wedge of 12. This pulmonary artery, it's a delicate piece of the body. So we want to be sure not to aggressively push against resistance, or we want to make sure, we also want to make sure that this balloon is always deflated and it's not stuck in the inflated position. So you shouldn't be wedging every hour. It's not appropriate to do that. I would ask your physician how often do they want us to check a wedge, typically once a shift. Same thing with cardiac output and index, how often do they want us to check those? So if you guys have any questions, please let me know, comment.